Welcome to another episode of the How to Do Your 20s podcast. And in this episode, I have Will, who is a really interesting guy. He's started out studying videography, ended up pretty much ditching that, teaching himself programming. Now he's a full-time programmer. And we're going to talk about in this episode how to make an app, how to submit it to the store, some coding, how to do basic coding, and also a nonprofit that he runs that's all about helping other nonprofits. So Will, first off, thank you so much for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I guess let's just jump right into it. Any recommendation? How do you make an app? How do you actually submit it to the store? What's the first step if someone's looking to make an app that they should take?
Yeah, so I'll start by saying this is for iOS. I don't have any experience with Android apps, but I have I've personally submitted 3 apps to the App Store, and there's 4 apps out there that I've worked heavily on. So the first thing is to have an idea, and ideas are pretty cheap. I think as soon as you identify yourself as an app developer, you'll have at least a person a day come to you with an app idea. So if you're starting out building apps, I would really recommend that you choose an idea that's yours, because you're going to be more passionate about that idea, and there's going to be a lot of roadblocks to getting it out there. So if it's your own idea, you'll push through a little bit better. So once you have the idea, you have to figure out what the experience is going to be. Wireframing is really good for that, kind of sketching out what each screen needs to do and how one moves to the other. And then after that, you need to start figuring out how to wire it up and code it together so that it's real and it works. I don't know, how deep do you want me to get into that?
So the wireframe, so all that is
Yeah,
basically you just draw on a piece of paper what each different screen should look like.
yeah. I mean, it can be as simple as taking a pencil and a piece of paper and draw a rectangle, and now that's your screen. And you figure out, where do you want the button? You want it at the top left, or do you want it big and in the middle? And then when you press that button, you take an arrow and you go from that button and you draw another rectangle, and then that's your second screen. And you can keep it real simple. All you want to do is kind of record the flow so that it's not in your head, and you have a quick, easy way to both refer to it when you're wiring it up and sharing it with somebody else to explain the idea more easily to them. And it's really good for conceptualizing the whole flow of an app. It's hard to do that in your head.
Two things you said that I really like, and the first one is you're right. As soon as you tell people, oh, I design iPhone apps, everybody has an idea. Everybody's like, oh my God, you should think about doing this. And for my last job, or my last real job, I designed iPhone apps, and I had a friend of my dad say, oh, when I was a kid, I used to play this game. I think it'd be a really great app. And it's called Stopwatch Baseball, and you try to get as close to 1 second as possible. And he's like, that should make that in an app. And it was something really simple. And I'm like, that sounds kind of fun. And so I went ahead and did it, and did exactly what you're talking about with the wireframing and everything. But I guess one problem a lot of people have is, how do you learn how to code?
Well, that is definitely the biggest hurdle, I think, for making an app. So I'll back up just a little bit. The way I started building apps was I had my own idea. Specifically, it was for a little calculator. So I wanted to know how old a package of eggs were. I was doing a recipe, and I was going to poach an egg, and it said, use the freshest eggs you can find. And I said, okay, well, just because I buy it doesn't mean they're fresh. I don't know how long they've been sitting on the shelf. So I looked into it, and I found out that, okay, there's a 3-digit number on every package of eggs that corresponds to the day of the year they were laid or packaged, right? So if January 15th is 15 and December 31st is 365. So I'll just figure out what today's number is and subtract it, and then I can find out how old the eggs are. So that was the idea for my first app, and it sounds very simple. And I will caution you against that word, simple. When you were talking about an app and simple in the same sentence, that is very dangerous, because no matter how simple it is, and we're going to talk about this from end to end here, it is not a simple process to build an app. So once I had an idea, I knew that there were a couple elements that I needed to have. I needed to have a text input where you could look at the package of eggs and input that number that you saw on the package, right? It's going to be a 3-digit number. And then I need to take that number and subtract it from whatever today's number is. Okay, so now I need to find today's number. Now I have the next problem. And you go through and you find step by step what you need to complete to get to your end goal, right? So the end goal is a number of days old, and my input is a 3-digit number. How do I get from A to B? There's a whole bunch of steps in between. As far as how to learn to code, I decided, so I had zero programming knowledge when I started this. I had not coded a web page. I had not done anything. But I thought, well, I want to build an app. I don't want somebody else to build this. This sounds like fun. So I literally, I remember my wife was going on a vacation. And so I decided that I would just go to a Panera, and I would sit down, and I bought a programming book, and I had my laptop, and I was going to teach myself Objective-C. And so I set the book down, I got my computer out, and I started going through the examples, thinking that, by the end of the day, I'd have a firm enough grasp that I could just build an app. It's a little more complicated than that. Just knowing Objective-C isn't enough. You have to learn some very basic things before you learn the more complex things. And then when you learn the complex things, you realize that really doesn't have anything to do with building an app.
Do you have an example?
Sure. So you might know as all the Objective-C in the world, but when you need to get that number from the text input field, that's a Cocoa API. That's something that Apple has written, and now you need to know. The Objective-C is just the syntax. That's just how you grab it. And you might do some Objective-C for the math and the calculations and stuff, but you need to now, you essentially need to learn how to read documentation from Apple's website. So you need to figure out how to get the value of the input, and it's text, so it's a string. Now I need to turn that string into a number so that I can manipulate it and divide it and subtract it. And so all those little things are really where the challenge lies. It's not so much in learning the Objective-C, I think, as learning how to interact with the inputs and outputs of an app that were the biggest hurdles for me, at least. And how did I learn that? I just trial and error, Stack Overflow, Google searching. The books didn't help me there, right? The books gave me a firm enough grasp of the syntax that I could understand, okay, this is defining a variable, this is manipulating something in this way, this is doing whatever it's doing, but to actually connect the points A to B to C, that's where just finding other code examples, seeing what other people did, finding out something that's close enough to what I want to do that I can change this little piece and it's mine. That's how I learned.
This might be
enough other people's.
This might be the most important thing that's said during the entire podcast, because it's so true. That's how I taught myself how to code. That's how I taught myself math even. Like, for instance, with math, I'd look at, all right, I don't know how to do this problem, and I'd look at the step-by-steps, how you do the problem, and then the next time that problem came, I'd be like, well, I don't know how to do this one still. I'd look at the step-by-steps, and by the third time, it's like, well, I just substitute the numbers. And it's the same thing with coding, right? It's like, okay, this person, 99.9% of all the coding problems anyone doing a first-time app will have has already been solved by somebody else. You're not doing something that crazy. And usually it's something like you said. And just a quick side note, actually. A string, for anybody listening, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's basically just a bunch of letters as opposed to a bunch of numbers. It's a variable that holds letters. So, but that's information that you can find out just by Googling it. I don't know if you have a different definition of string.
Yeah, I would say it's a type of variable that holds, I don't know, text, for lack of a better word,
yeah.
Right? So somebody would probably know of a better definition, but that's how I would say for most people, that's what it is.
Exactly, but that's the kind of knowledge, because as you're talking, I'm sure there's a lot of people that they're like, what do you mean a string? Like they're imagining a piece of yarn or something like that. It's like,
no, good point, great point.
Yeah, and there's a lot of stuff like that that'll probably be said during this episode, or just in general if you're trying to find out how to do an app, that you're not going to know at first, but literally Google's your best friend when learning something like this. There's so much knowledge out there.
Absolutely. Google and patience, right? Patience and resolve, because it's going to be hard when you're running into roadblocks and you don't know what you're doing and you feel like, okay, maybe I shouldn't have ever tried this. But if you persevere through that, you'll get there. So this was, I'm going to use this word cautiously, simple, right? The egg checker app was a simple app. It took me a year to build it. Right, like today, I might be able to build that in a week or a couple days, but it was the first project, and I didn't work on it every day. because I would get frustrated, but I would come back to it and pick it up, and you just got to keep going and trust yourself that you can learn this, you can figure it out, you can make it work. If you keep going, you'll get there.
Another thing you were talking about before was Stack Overflow. And for people that don't know, that's a site where you can submit code and ask people, hey, I don't know why this isn't working. Can you let me know? And it's great
Hmm.
because you get really experienced users for free telling you, oh, you forgot to put a comma here, or whatever little stupid things. And it's going to happen when you're making an app where you forget one stupid letter or comma or semicolon or whatever, and it completely crashes your program. So Stack Overflow is your friend.
Stack Overflow is probably your best friend. I can't think it, right? Like if you Google a programming question, your top results are always Stack Overflow. And there's a reason. It's because that's the best content. And it's also because, like you said earlier, you're not the first person to have a problem. You are not the first person to want to do this thing. Someone else has already asked and someone else has already answered. And it is an amazing resource. So it's basically a website, like you said, where people can ask a question, submit answers, but then you also upvote the best answer. And the question asker can also mark the correct one, the one that fixed their problem. And it's an unbelievable resource for not only beginner programmers, but expert programmers as well. Because there's always a new problem that you have, and it's almost never the first time it's happened.
Absolutely. And so I guess the next step is basically, so you have the screens and using, I forget the name of the software that you use to develop iOS programs. I don't know if you
Xcode.
Xcode, yeah. You
Xcode. It sounds very technical.
It does, but you basically you create the screens, right? And then you kind of map them up with different uh, methods or different lines of code, correct?
Yeah, so there's inside of Xcode, there's Interface Builder, which is a nice, like, it's a drag and drop interface for building the apps. And it can look a little too easy at first. And it is, you can't just put a button there and the button works. You have to tell the button what to do. So it's a little bit more technical than it looks at first. But it's a great way. You could even wire Interface Builder. That would be a great idea. You have all the buttons and all the text and all the stuff that you can just drag and drop in there. If you don't want to do it with paper and pencil, you could certainly wireframe an Interface Builder. But once you put the screens together there, drag a button here, add some text there, then you can wire up methods to those text inputs or those text buttons. And so what you would say is, okay, this text input, when it changes, meaning, every time they type a letter, the input would change because what's displayed changed. Fire this method. And so every time that method fires, it'll do something. And what it does is up to you. You have to program that. But for example, what it might do is okay, every time the text input changes, fire update text, which is our method name. And in there it says, okay, well, what's in the text input? Okay, it gets that. And it says, okay, how many digits is it? Or how long is the text, right? Because we're looking for 3 digits. Okay, it's 1 digit. Do nothing. Just stop. And then the next time they push in a number, it's going to update again. It's going to fire that same method. And it's going to say, okay, are we at 3 digits? No. When it gets to 3 digits, then it can do something else. And it can say, okay, well, now we have 3 digits. We're ready to do our calculation. And then it can fire another method to do the calculation.
So once your program's all ready, what's the next steps to actually submitting it to the store and getting it approved?
So the next step is, so you have to be a paid developer through the Apple account, developer account to submit. So you have to pay $100 a year to submit apps and keep them in the store. And once you have that membership, what you do is you bundle up and code sign the app. And this is, in the Apple world, kind of more complicated than it should be. I have not submitted an app in maybe a year and a half. The most recent app I did, I was not the person who submitted it, so maybe it's gotten better. But they have some websites where you go and you have to generate a package name, or like you have to, it's complicated, right? Like I've only done it 3 times, so I don't have a firm grasp on it. But basically you have to code sign it in a way that says, this is a legitimate Apple app. And then you upload it to Apple. And it goes through their review process where they have somebody that pulls it up, make sure it's not doing anything malicious, make sure it's not using the camera when it says it's not, or taking your contacts or doing anything bad. And then if they give it the thumbs up, then they push it to the App Store. And that is always like a super tense moment, right? When you're watching just these little bubbles change in the developer portal, and it goes from ready for review to in review to I can't wait. You know, I'm waiting to see if it's good or it's bad or if I'm going to get rejected. That is a fun, exciting, tense moment, and when it's finally in the App Store, uh, it's worth all the hard work you put in because you see you've built something and it's out there for the world, and even if only a couple people download it, it's such a great feeling. It's so exhilarating. It really keeps you going.
It is a great accomplishment. And I kind of want to shift gears here a little bit. And what kind of mistakes do you see beginner coders or beginner app makers making with their apps?
I would say the biggest thing is trying to do something too complicated. Um, I think it's really important to start as small as possible. Just have the app do something simple but useful, very focused. Um, the best apps do one thing really well. They don't do 1,000 things. That's not the app mentality, right? You have 1,000 apps on your phone for that reason. They're focused, they do one thing really well, and don't try to do too much because when you do, people don't know why they're opening your app, right? Or it's open. Maybe you think it's going to be open all the time, but it's just not. People are going to go to your app for one specific thing. They're going to associate that icon and that color with that thing, and they're going to go there when they need it, maybe for 10, 15 seconds or maybe longer depending on the thing, but it does one thing really well. So focus on an idea that is as focused and defined as possible.
You know, I'll also add to that, even if you're trying to do a more advanced or complicated app, make sure the first time around you have the minimal viable product. And what I mean by that is something that's just one of the features, and then build on it because that first feature is going to be a lot harder than you think. And you can always go
Yep.
back and add more to it, but it's a great sense of accomplishment to get one thing done that maybe let's say it takes you 3 months as opposed to trying to start a project that's going to take you a year and a half to get done. It's easy to quit when you have too complicated of an app ahead of you.
I totally agree. I think that is such an important point. And I think in software development in general, it's a very, very accepted point of view that you need to put the minimum viable product out there and iterate on it, right? And when you're starting software development for the first time, maybe this perception has changed a little bit since everybody uses apps a lot more often and you're used to the updates. But when software development was young, you would think of it just like physical hardware development, right? So let's say I'm making not an app, but I'm making a notebook. Okay, I'm making a notebook. I got to figure out the pages. I got to figure out the cover. I got to figure out the packaging. And once I ship it to you and you buy it, it's there. I can't update it. I can't choose a different color. I can't say, oh boy, people are really asking for lined instead of dotted pages. I'm just going to ship that update. You can't because they've already bought it. You have time and resources invested in that. And software's that way. It's inherently different. So getting something out to them as soon as possible and pushing updates as often as possible is the best way to do it.
Absolutely. And I think from a psychological perspective, for your own sanity, as someone that's gone both ways with different things, I really believe if you're not kind of embarrassed by the first version of something, you waited too long to update, to release it.
Yes, I totally agree on that. And I would also say something I found from experience in all my coding, not just iOS apps, but on the web as well. I would say the learning curve is so fast that by the end of the project, I'm always embarrassed of the code I wrote at the beginning of the project.
Mm-hmm.
Because no matter what you do, at least I haven't gotten to the point yet where I've learned so much that I'm just, I've stopped learning. I am constantly making mistakes and finding better ways to do something. And even if it's a website that I work on for a week and ship it, the code I wrote at the beginning is not as good as the code I wrote at the end. And I always wish that I could go back and make it better. And I think that's super healthy because it means that you're learning. It means that you're getting better. And so don't get frustrated by that. Embrace that and go make it better or make the next project better. But you're always going to look back at the code you wrote before and say, oh, why did I do that? Or what was I thinking? But that should be exciting. It's exciting to me.
That's actually a really good segue into the next topic I want to talk about, which is giving the audience like a basic understanding of how coding works. And I think one of the first things to understand is variables and what variables are. Can you define what a variable is?
Yeah, so a variable it's a way to store a piece of information so that you can retrieve it or change it later on. That's about as good as I can do.
Yeah, I'll also add that, you can think about variables kind of like you would math in, seventh grade when your x equals 10. So in a line of programming, you could say x equals 10, or for instance, using your egg thing, current date plus 3 would be 3 days from now. And then in the programming language, the information that current date is holding is just whatever the current date is. And then you can say date 3 days from now. That'd be the next variable. And then you could do date 3 days from now equals current date plus 3. And there you have two variables that you've created. And something interesting that we talked about before too is there's different type of variables, and a string is text information, and then you have others like a double and things like that that are just pure numbers. So that's a little bit how I define a variable, I think.
Yeah, I think another good way to conceptualize the value of it is to think about if you have a lot of calculations to do, right? Say you have 15 things that you need to do to find out what today's date is. Okay, I have to, I know that there's 12 months in the year. I find what month it is, and then I find what day it is, and I add that, and I add all the days before, and I do all these calculations to figure out what a value is. Well, you want to store that result so that you don't have to do all those calculations every time you need it. So if you can save that result and know how long that's valid for, right? So tomorrow, it's that result plus 1, but you don't need to do all those calculations again. As fast as our computers are, anytime that you can save work, it's good. And it's just more convenient to be able to store things. So that's why you want to use a variable is when you have something that you want to retrieve easily later.
It also makes it very human readable. Like if you just had a bunch of numbers and calculations and there's no variable there to say what this whole thing is, sometimes it's a little intimidating. It's like, well, wait a minute, why are we doing this? And of course you can comment the code, but sometimes I find with myself it's just easier to give the variable a solid name that explains what it is. So I can say, like we were talking about, current date equals whatever, and then I'm like, oh, all these calculations are to get the current date. Okay, this makes sense now.
Yep, naming things is one of the hardest problems in computer science, right? It's naming it descriptive enough that when you come back to it later, you know exactly what it is, but not so verbose that it's taking over multiple lines and it's not a paragraph.
Absolutely.
It's difficult to name things, but it is important.
The next thing is objects and methods, and I kind of have a harder time talking about these, but maybe you can talk about them a little bit more.
I don't have a great way to explain them, but I will try. So if you think of, so we'll start with a method. So a method, no, we should start with an object. I might pass on this because I'm afraid that I will describe it wrong.
Let me try to describe it actually now that I've thought about it, and tell me where I'm wrong and what things could be changed. You have a car, and the different attributes are things like color, engine size, number of doors. So the object itself is a car, and you can say, okay, well, the attribute color equals red, number of doors equals 4, engine equals V8, and then there's also the idea of method. So within that object, you can run a method that says turn on car. And so when you run that method, it's an action that's being taken. And in programming, it's done for all kinds of reasons. So you might have an object that is, let's say you even have an object that's car in your program, and you might want to say get color. And then it'll return the value of the color of that object.
Yeah, so I love that. I was trying to think of an analogy, and I love that one. So let's roll with it. Let's back up one more level, and let's say that our base object is vehicle, right? Okay, so I have a vehicle, and vehicle has color, engine, tires, blah, 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 and it has methods, which are things that happen, right? It has method for go, stop, reverse, all of those. And then you have all these things defined, and you may want to reuse them in some way, but with a slight modification, right? So what you would do is you would subclass that. You would say, a car is a subclass of this vehicle. And so by default, it has all of the same things that a vehicle has, but I can add or change some things, right? So a motorcycle is also a subclass of a vehicle, but it has 2 wheels instead of 4. So I'm going to change that. the colors might change everywhere, but there's some things that you want to reuse. You don't want to rewrite everything that has to do with a vehicle every time. You can it's basically comes down to reusability. And it's a term abstraction. You want to make things as generic as possible at first, and then make them more specific as your needs get more specific.
Exactly.
So thank you for bringing up the car. That helped me a lot. I was trying to think of something off the cuff, and I couldn't think up a good analogy there.
It sounds a little bit complicated as we're talking about it, I'm sure, but it really isn't once you start actually doing the programming itself. It's a lot more intuitive. But I think another thing, and something I really find interesting, is just the logic of programming. And we talked about this a little bit earlier. And I think once you learn some basic programming, it makes you a better manager. It makes you a more logical thinker. It helps you in your own work because you're able to take tasks and break them up into smaller tasks. And one great example of this is if else, in my opinion, which in coding is basically if this statement is true, do this stuff. So, for instance, if today's date is past June 1st, add 5 days to today's date. If it's before, add only 3 days. And the if else is one of my favorite, I think, of all the different logic, logical, I don't know what the word is, logic, I don't know, tests?
Yeah, yeah. It's definitely a great place to start. And in a programming book, it's probably the first thing that they're going to introduce to you as well. And it's really powerful, but it's really simple at its core. And I was actually introduced to if else for the first time in my formal logic class in college, which at the time I thought I was never going to use for anything. But thinking through the flow of a program, it's insanely helpful to be able to have these forks in the road where you get to decide whether something's going to go left or go right, and that's the core of an if-else statement. You have two options, or you can do else ifs in the middle. So you can have your first statement if, and then you can say, basically it goes top down, right? So you start with the if x equals 3, do this. Okay, well x doesn't equal 3, so it's going to go to the next thing. And then you can have as many other else ifs as you want. If x equals 4, do this thing. If x equals 5, do this thing. Else is kind of the catch-all, right? So if any of those specific things up above don't match or don't pass the test, then else is going to catch them all and say, sometimes it's as simple as, okay, don't do anything, right? That's my else. Just do nothing. That's fine. And there's a lot of that in programming, and there's nothing wrong with that.
We were talking before the episode. I have an assistant in the Philippines. So, she has good English, but not perfect English. And this is a lot of times I won't write it in programming language, but I'll say things such as, if we get an email that says this, this, and this, respond with this. If it says this, this, and this, respond with this. If you have no idea what to say, the else for me would be put it in a special folder that I check and respond to. And it's insanely helpful. And everybody listening to this does this on some level. You're talking about the forks in the road. If the left road is flooded, use the right road. If the right road, has a car broken down in the middle, use the left road, whatever. But I think when you start learning how to program, it makes the tasks in your life you're able to break them down into specific things as opposed to just kind of like, I don't know, I just do it. You're like, no, this is how I do it, which I find immensely helpful.
Yeah, I love that. I love that what you said, that everybody does this every day, whether they realize it or not. And I think that's true with a lot of the logic and programming. The same way we make decisions is some of the same ways that you need to think about the logic program. Generally, you just have to be a lot more specific.
Two more that I'll cover really quick that I think are interesting are for loops and while loops, and then we'll get into API. But can you talk a little bit about for loops and while loops? And these two are things that we use every day. We just don't think about it.
Yeah, so a for loop and a while loop, or loops in general, we'll say. There's maybe a couple other ones. But this is something where you might want to do something a whole bunch of times, and you want to define that in a very succinct way, right? Because the less code you have in a program, the less bugs you have in a program. So you want to be as non-verbose as possible. So a loop lets you execute a block of code a bunch of times. And a for loop basically says, a lot of for loops are set up to do something a set number of times. So you might say, for 100 times, increment this counter, or I don't know, post a status to Facebook for 500 times or something like that.
Hmm.
Um, and it just loops that same amount of code again and again and again and again, so you don't have to write it 500 times. It also lets you control how many times on the fly that code executes. So maybe based on a certain other variable in your program,
Hmm.
you pass that variable in as the value of how many times it loops, and it does that. A while loop checks at the end of every loop to make sure something is still true. So while I'm trying to think of a real world example of this thing instead of saying while X is true. Um, so I'm going to give up and just go with a programming example.
Well, I got
While
one
X,
maybe that you use
okay,
every
cool.
day is while they're unfolded close, fold close. Once there's no more unfolded close, you stop because it's just there's no more. So your variable could be if x equals unfolded close and it starts at 10, then well x is above or above 0, keep folding close. So your loop itself would be run the method fold close. So you pick up one item, fold it, whatever, then subtract 1 from x, and then go back to the loop again and just keep doing that over and over again. Very simple example, I think.
That's great. You're great with the analogies. I'm pulling up blanks today, but you're nailing it.
So I guess anything else on for loops and while loops?
No, no, I think that that's pretty good coverage of them.
Yeah, and I think that once again, these are things that it might sound kind of abstract right now, but these are two of my favorite things to do while programming just because they're so versatile. But APIs is the next thing I wanted to talk about. And I recently started working with APIs. I never did it at my last job. That was like too advanced for me. But now that I have my own company, I was like, all right, it's time to finally tackle this whole API thing. And they're so powerful. And I know you recently had to explain to somebody what an API is. So what is an API?
Yeah, so I like to explain it as a formal way of getting information from something. So API, it stands for Application Programming Interface, which doesn't help anybody with the definition. That is completely nonsensical, even when you know what APIs are. But basically, I like to juxtapose it against what it's not, right? So I think the opposite of using an API to get information is web scraping, right? So let's say you want to get all of the products that Target has on Target.com. Well, what you could do is you could write a program that visits every link on every page of Target.com and finds out, okay, there's a product here, so I'm going to look for the product title, and I'm going to save that in a database and product description, and I'm going to do this a whole bunch of times for the entire website. And that's called web scraping. That's when you're pulling up a website and you're scraping all the information off of it and storing it yourself. The opposite of that would be if Target had an API that you could query. You please give me all of your products,
Mm-hmm.
and they would send back in a nice, neatly formatted way all of the products that they had, and you would know it's up to date at that time for all of them. Also, it would be sanctioned by them, so it would have all the correct information. You don't have to worry about a bug in your program, and assuming that your program took 2 weeks to run, the stuff you collected at the beginning would not be relevant at the end. So I like to juxtapose it against web scraping because I think that explains what it isn't, like the opposite of what it is. Um, is there anything you would add to that?
Yeah, I
Is that
mean,
clear?
yeah, I think it's pretty clear. But one example I had is basically it's programs or websites talking, and they talk in a very official way. So it's saying exactly like you were saying, but I had to use it recently because I wanted to get the stuff from my store, the data that's on my store, like as far as customers, what they order, all that kind of information into a Google Doc in an automatic way. So every day it updates. So I don't have to go to my store, export a file, copy and paste it. And what I had to do was use an API. So every day my website creates a big long list and it's really formatted nicely. It says, okay, in this section there is the order information. In this next section down below, is, the order ID, what they ordered, blah, blah, blah. And so it makes it very simple to write a program to go through and say, hey, this bit of data, what is it? Oh, okay, it's this. This is where it belongs in the Google spreadsheet. And that's the basic definition I think I'd give.
Yeah, I guess what it comes down to is it's a program that has a very specific set of inputs and outputs, right? So for that one, it turns e-commerce data into a Google spreadsheet, right? So it has to take the data in a certain way, and then when it comes out the other end, it's going to be different. It's going to be in this format. Uh, and APIs don't have to be public. They can be internal. They don't have to be exposed to the world. They can just be used. I could have my own API. Our company could have our own API that we don't share with anybody. So the definition is not open to the world, but I guess it's just a program, really, right? It takes inputs and it does something to what you input and it outputs it. And at its core, that's probably a strong concept to have because it helps reinforce the fact that there's all kinds of different APIs. APIs can do anything. And there are good APIs and there are bad APIs and there are APIs that will break and there are APIs that will not give you things that the way it promises. So it's not, you can't learn APIs. You could learn how to do documentation for APIs or best practices for APIs, but an API is not something you can learn in the same way as a programming language.
Sure, exactly. So that was a lot of information on how to do an app,
Yeah.
coding, and everything. So hopefully you guys are still listening to this episode because that was very knowledge dense. But now I want to kind of talk a little bit about your nonprofit, which is Drive to Create. What is Drive to Create?
Yeah, Drive to Create is something that I helped start almost 3 years ago. It's a nonprofit that helps other nonprofits. Um, we are a 501c3, and we exclusively help 501c3s by providing marketing services. So we identified a need where we saw some really great nonprofits who were giving every dollar they raised to whatever their mission was, whatever they were trying to help. They were giving every single dollar and every single resource towards that, and they weren't doing anything to promote themselves. And so they were suffering a little bit and they were struggling. And we thought, what could we do to help? We could devote our time to helping nonprofits embrace the power of marketing, get materials that help them fundraise so that they can better serve the people that they help. And so we started this organization. I'm not the founder, but I was one of the founding members in March of 2012. And the way it works is we take applications from nonprofits. We figure out what they need, and we make sure that we have the skills to fulfill that, so it's a good match. And then we do one-day creative marathons. So it's kind of, you can think of it like a hackathon or something where we show up for one day. We do as much as we possibly can. And then at the end of the day, everything that we've made, we give to them for free. So it's all volunteer-based. No one's on salary. No one gets paid. The only costs we have are travel costs because we like to do these face-to-face because the feedback loops are a lot tighter and we get to just have a better rapport with the people we're helping. But we'll do anything from, I've made websites in a day. We've done videos in a day. We have a really talented set of videographers who can film, edit, and export a video all in a day. We do professional photography. We do copywriting. We do design brochures and PowerPoints and whatever they need. But we all show up on one day and we help them out. And at the end of the day, everything we made is theirs for free.
What is a 501c3? Like, how is that defined? And the expenses, as far as like your travel expenses, does that come from donations, or how do you get money for that?
Yeah, we do very little fundraising. We've had two fundraisers where we've made maybe a couple $1,000s total, and we've helped 12 organizations. So, we're really proud of how far we make our money go. The first 2 years of the nonprofit, we called them drive weeks, where we would schedule 4 or 5 organizations in a week, and we would go one to the other to the other to the other. So we rented a van. We had some hotel room costs to just drive around the state. We went as far as New York, and we would just do one after another, like 12, 14-hour days. And it was exhausting, but super exhilarating and rewarding. What we've gotten to recently is more spread out. So we do better work on every day if it's not the fourth day in the 4-day stretch.
Gotcha. So I gotta ask, have you thought about why help nonprofits as opposed to trying to make a business out of this, trying to make a quick buck, if you will?
And so, I've done a little freelancing. I think all the other members of the group have done a little freelancing. And there's a different set of constraints that you have and a different set of rewards that you feel when you're donating things. Certainly, you want the clients to be happy both ways. But it feels good to be helping somebody who's not handing you a check at the end of the day. It's a much different perspective on the project. And it feels more like a creative outlet than a job does. A job can be sometimes more stressful, can be, you can end up doing a whole lot of things that you don't want to do. And I think a lot of that is eliminated just in the construct of these one-day marathons, right? We show up for a day and there's a lot of urgency and there's a lot of collaboration and we do a ton on that day. But it feels much more like a creative outlet than a job. And I think the fact that we're doing these for nonprofits and everyone that we visited has an incredible mission that we're just in awe of. Anywhere from helping moms who have preemie babies in the NICU to an organization that helps train like seeing eye dogs and dogs for different people with disabilities to the Ohio Shakespeare Festival, who puts on educational plays for schools and helps kids appreciate Shakespeare. It's all really good stuff that we can feel really good about helping with, and it just feels good at the end of the day. So why nonprofits? Because it's more fun. Because the work you're doing always feels like you're making the world better, and you don't always feel like that when you're doing paid gigs.
That's a great answer. Nick, thank you so much for coming on. Do you have anything to share with the audience before you go?
So I would just say, if you have something that you want to learn, do it. With it, figure it out. I went from knowing nothing about programming to having a couple apps in the App Store, and I am by no means an expert. If I can do it, you can do it. Just stick with it. Find your learning style. Figure out how you learn and embrace that. It might be different from everybody else, but if you can identify how you learn, there is nothing that you can't do.
I love it. Nick, thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed that video, and if you did, make sure you hit the big red subscribe button down below. You can also check me out on Facebook and on Twitter, and I release a new video every Monday, and by hitting that subscribe button, you'll get those new videos every Monday. And this is really a podcast. It's also a website. You can check out the website. It's howtodoyour20s.com. I'll put a link right over here as well. And what it's all about is trying to improve your life. And we specifically focus on things that people in their 20s are interested in. So make sure you like the video if you liked it. Subscribe. Like us on Facebook and Twitter, whatever. But I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you again on another video.